I don't think most people understand how quickly a house can turn from a home into a prison. You buy a place, you put your things in it, and you settle down with the quiet confidence that its walls are there to keep everything out. But sometimes those same walls, they keep things in. The house my family lived in wasn't old by any means. Early 80s construction, split level, beige siding with brown trim. Nothing about it screamed haunted or cursed. It was in a safe neighborhood, with lawns that all looked too manicured, the kind of place where you'd never expect anything unusual. That's what made what happened to us so much worse. It didn't happen in some Gothic mansion or a cabin deep in the woods. It happened in a normal, suburban house. It started with a sound. At first, it was faint, soft enough that I almost dismissed it. Lying in bed one night, I heard it from behind my headboard, which rested against the wall that separated my room from the hallway closet. A dull, muffled knock. Not sharp like knuckles on wood, but heavier. Almost like someone rapping against drywall with the side of their fist. 3 taps. Then silence. I held my breath, waiting. The air in the room felt thick, still. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. But nothing else came. I eventually let it go, telling myself houses make noises, pipes, settling wood, the usual excuses you reach for when you're alone and don't want to feel afraid. The next night, it happened again. Same time, almost to the minute. Just past midnight. 3 slow knocks, dragging out as though whoever, or whatever, was doing it wanted to be sure I heard. The sound was close. Too close. It wasn't like a neighbor's TV bleeding through the walls or some animal in the attic. It was right behind the plaster, right where I laid my head every night. The third night, my sister heard it too. Her room was across the hall, but when the knocks came, she ran out into the hallway, pale and wide-eyed, asking if I had just banged on the wall. I hadn't. We both knew it. When we told our parents, they brushed it off as nothing. They gave us that tired, dismissive look parents give when kids talk about ghosts or monsters. Pipes, they said. The house shifting. But even they grew quiet when a week later, the sound spread. It wasn't just my room anymore. It was theirs. Every night, just past midnight, the knocking would start. Always behind a wall. Sometimes the bedroom wall, sometimes the living room wall. Once, in the kitchen, my mom froze mid-step when the sound came from directly behind the fridge. Always the same, 3 slow, deliberate raps. Then silence. It became part of our nights. We'd go to bed tense, waiting, dreading. And the moment the house went still, the knocks would begin. The strange part was the consistency. It wasn't random creaks or shifting wood. It wasn't rats or raccoons scratching around. The knocks came in 3s, always spaced apart just enough to feel intentional. And then nothing until the next night. I started to notice how my body reacted to it. The way my skin prickled before it even began, like my nerves knew it was coming. The way the silence afterward felt worse than the sound itself, like the walls were holding their breath with me. Soon I couldn't sleep. None of us could. The knocking became a countdown, waiting for it, dreading it. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight seeping through my curtains, listening for every small shift in the house. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock. And then like clockwork, knock, knock, knock. One night, I pressed my ear against the wall. The plaster was cool beneath my skin, and I could hear something faint. Not just the knocks, but almost a hollow resonance behind them. Like there was space back there, more than just studs and insulation. I whispered into the darkness of my room, though I didn't know why. It wasn't like I expected an answer. But deep inside, I was terrified of one. My father finally decided to check it out. He knocked on the wall during the day, testing for hollow spots, running his hand across the paint as though he'd feel something unusual. He pulled the closet shelves down, shining a flashlight into the dark, but found nothing. Just wood, insulation, drywall. Nothing to explain why every single night, at exactly the same time, we all sat frozen in our beds, waiting for the knocks to come. The weeks dragged into months, and our home no longer felt like ours. My mom grew withdrawn, snapping at little things. My sister stopped sleeping in her own room, curling up on the couch instead. My father avoided talking about it altogether. It was like we all silently agreed not to give it more power by acknowledging it out loud. But the silence between us was just as heavy as the silence before the knocking each night. Then something changed. The knocks got louder. Instead of 3 soft raps, they became forceful, aggressive, shaking the pictures on the walls. Once, I swore I saw the frame above my bed tilt slightly, as if something had struck from the other side. The air felt colder in the house, and a strange odor lingered at night. Not the sour smell of mold or the sharp bite of paint, but something metallic like rust or blood. I tried to ignore it, but it followed me. If I lay in the living room, the knocks would come from behind the sofa wall. If I moved to the basement, I'd hear them echo through the foundation. It was as though something inside the walls was following me, aware of where I was. The worst part was when I realized it wasn't just at night anymore. One afternoon, while my parents were at work and my sister was out, I sat in the kitchen doing homework. The sun was bright, streaming through the sliding glass doors. The house felt alive with the normal daytime sounds, birds, cars passing outside. And then, from behind the wall near the pantry, knock, knock, knock. Daylight didn't protect me anymore. I stopped telling anyone when it happened. What was the point? We all heard it. We all knew. But none of us wanted to admit that it was escalating. The final night I spent in that house is the one that will never leave me. I woke at 12:07 a.m., the time I'd come to dread more than anything else. The house was silent, the kind of silence that swallows everything, where even your breathing feels too loud. I lay there, staring into the dark, waiting. My stomach twisted, tight with fear. Then it came. Knock. But it wasn't behind my wall this time. It was under my bed. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound had changed too. It wasn't the dull thud of fist against drywall. It was sharper, closer, as though nails or bones had tapped directly against the wooden frame beneath me. Knock. This time the bed trembled. Knock. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and ran from the room. My feet slapped against the carpet, then the hall floor, and I didn't stop until I reached the living room where the faint glow of the streetlight made the world less dark. My family was already there, my sister clutching a blanket, my mom wide-eyed and pale, my father standing rigid, fists clenched. No one said a word, but we all knew. The knocking wasn't just in the walls anymore. We moved out 2 weeks later. We never explained to anyone why. We left furniture behind, boxes half-packed, like we couldn't get away fast enough. The house is still there. Another family lives in it now. Sometimes I wonder if they've heard it yet, the slow, deliberate knocking that begins just after midnight. The sound that comes from behind the walls until it doesn't. I don't know when it truly began. Sometimes I tell myself it started that first week I moved in, though I didn't recognize it for what it was. Other nights, I think it must have been happening long before me, and I just stumbled into a place that had already been rotting from the inside out. What I do know is that the building where I lived wasn't special. It was just another mid-rise brick apartment block, squeezed between two nearly identical structures, as if the city had rubber-stamped a mold and pressed it across the street. I was on the 6th floor, in a one-bedroom unit that smelled faintly of stale carpet and plaster dust when I first walked in. Nothing unusual, just the odor of decades of tenants cycling through, layering their lives on top of each other until everything blended into a flat, musty sameness. The walls were off-white, the kind of color that isn't painted so much as dulled by years of hands brushing against it. The radiator rattled in bursts, coughing heat unevenly through the rooms. I told myself I could get used to it. For the first few nights, it was the usual city sounds that filled the dark. Sirens somewhere below, the hum of traffic even at odd hours, distant footsteps echoing in the hall. Nothing out of place. But then, one night as I lay half awake, I heard it. A sound that didn't fit. It was faint, almost easy to dismiss, but it had a character to it that lodged itself into my mind. Not the sharp creak of pipes, or the muffled thud of someone dropping something upstairs. This was deeper, hollower. A rhythm that suggested space inside the walls, like someone knocking on wood, but far away, as though there were an empty chamber behind the surface of my room, a cavity that shouldn't exist. I stayed frozen, my body stiff under the blankets, staring at the wall that separated my unit from the one next door. The sound came again, and this time I could almost picture it. The thud of something hollow, like a palm dragging or fingertips tapping on a large wooden box. Then silence. The next morning I convinced myself it was nothing. Old buildings make sounds, and I'd heard my share of strange noises in apartments before. Maybe it was the neighbors, maybe the pipes, maybe I had been half dreaming. But the following night, the sound returned. Louder, more deliberate. It came late, always late, when the city's noise dulled into a distant hush. The hollow thud would rise from the wall behind my headboard, not constant but recurring. A few knocks, then nothing. Minutes of silence, then a scraping, like nails dragged lightly over wood. I pressed my ear against the wall, half expecting to hear voices or the shuffle of someone moving in the next apartment. But all I heard was that strange emptiness, like the wall wasn't solid, as if the building was less real than it appeared. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern only grew stronger. I never saw anyone go in or out of the unit next to mine. The door always stayed locked. No sounds of television or movement ever came through during the day. Yet when night fell, the hollow noises returned, seeping through the plaster. Sometimes it was tapping. Sometimes it was a dragging sound, like something being pulled across a wooden floor just on the other side. Once, I swore I heard a faint exhale, a breath pressed right up against the shared wall. I started avoiding my bedroom at night, falling asleep on the couch with the glow of the television. But even there, I could sense it. The walls seemed thinner, the air carrying that vibration of hollow space. I caught myself knocking lightly against the plaster during the day, curious, testing it. The sound echoed strangely, not the dull thud of a solid wall, but something lighter, almost like tapping a drum. One evening, curiosity gnawed at me enough that I went into the hallway, standing before the door of the unit next to mine. The numbers were faded, half peeling off the metal plate. Dust gathered in the corners of the threshold, and the lock looked untouched, as though no key had slid into it for years. I pressed my ear against the door, holding my breath. Nothing, only the quiet hum of the building. I didn't linger. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, casting that sterile yellow glow that made everything feel a little too empty. The true breaking point came one night when I woke to the sound not of knocking, but of something heavier. A rhythmic pounding, like fists slamming against wood, echoing through the wall with a desperate cadence. It jolted me upright, my pulse thundering in my ears. I stared at the wall, and the sound seemed to reverberate inside my skull, shaking loose some instinctual dread I couldn't name. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. A silence so heavy it felt staged, as though something on the other side was waiting for me to react. I couldn't bring myself to move. My eyes stayed fixed on the plaster, half expecting it to bulge or crack, to reveal something pressing from the other side. The following morning, I went down to the leasing office under the guise of casual curiosity. I asked who lived in the unit next to mine. The manager, a tired woman behind a desk stacked with papers, gave me a puzzled look. She flipped through a folder, frowned, and told me the apartment had been vacant for months. That answer didn't settle me. It hollowed me out, the same way the wall did. That night, I stayed awake in the living room, lights off, listening. Hours passed. The radiator hissed and clicked. The city sounds ebbed away. And then, like clockwork, the hollow knocking returned. This time, it seemed closer, sharper. Not muffled by distance, but resonating, as if the wall itself was nothing but a thin shell separating me from whatever lay beyond. The knocks grew more erratic, interspersed with dragging sounds, like something pacing just behind the wall. I felt a pressure in the room, the air tightening, my lungs straining with each shallow breath. The odor of dust grew stronger, as if the plaster itself were crumbling from the inside. At one point, I swore I saw movement, not in the room itself, but in the texture of the wall. The shadows thrown by the streetlight outside seemed to ripple, as if the flat surface shifted, breathing. My eyes burned from not blinking, locked on the wall that no longer seemed inert. I don't know how long I sat there, but the sounds eventually faded, retreating into silence once more. I told myself I should leave, break the lease, move out before I became part of whatever was happening in that building. But I didn't. I stayed, and the hollow sounds still come. Not every night, but enough. Enough that I know they're not going away. Sometimes they're faint, just a few distant taps. Other times, they swell into pounding that shakes the frame of my bed, rattles the picture frames, and sends vibrations crawling through my bones. I've stopped asking questions. The next door unit is still empty. It will always be empty. And yet, when the night grows still and the air in my apartment thickens, I can hear it, the hollow sound of something moving, waiting behind the wall. I was 15 when my parents bought the house. It stood on a quiet street at the far edge of town, a place where streetlights flickered weakly and shadows seemed to last longer than they should. The paint on the siding had already faded into a grayish tone, the kind that carried the smell of rain even on dry days. The porch sagged in places, boards creaking like something inside was shifting with every step. From the very first moment, the air inside the house had a taste. Not just the faint must of dust, but something older, like wood that had absorbed years of dampness, carrying with it a sourness that clung to the tongue. Each room echoed when I walked through, as if the walls themselves were hollow, hiding empty spaces that shouldn't be there. I remember dragging my fingertips along the wallpaper and feeling faint bubbles under it, like skin stretched over something it wasn't meant to cover. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hall. The floor tilted just slightly, so no matter how carefully I set my things down, they slid an inch toward the wall when I wasn't looking. The ceiling sloped low, pressing down over the bed, and when I lay there at night, it felt as if the room was trying to close in on me. The first knock came 3 days after we moved in. It was soft, too soft to be mistaken for anything ordinary, and it came from inside the wall behind my headboard. I remember lying still, holding my breath, waiting for it again. And then it came, 3 gentle taps measured like fingertips. Not random creaks, not pipes shifting with temperature. It was too deliberate. At first I thought maybe it was just the house settling, but the knocks returned the following night, at almost the same hour. Always from the wall, always slow. I pressed my ear against the plaster once, and the chill of it ran deep into my skull. From inside, I swore I could hear a faint, hollow reverberation, as though the sound traveled through narrow channels hidden in the dark. Days blurred, but the nights sharpened into something unbearable. The house grew different after the sun went down. The light from the street barely reached the windows, and the corners of each room seemed to thicken, swallowing the glow of lamps. The air took on a heaviness, like standing in a cellar where the damp presses against your lungs. Every sound felt amplified, the groan of beams, the faint shiver of wind under the siding, and that persistent knocking that traveled from wall to wall. Sometimes it came from behind the closet, other times from beneath the floorboards. Once, it traced the length of the hallway, knocking at regular intervals, as though something unseen was walking along inside the walls, dragging its fingers to mark the path. I started to notice details I hadn't before. The wallpaper in my room peeled slightly near the floor, and behind the tear, I glimpsed darkness where there should have been plaster. Just blackness, swallowing the faint spill of light from my flashlight. When I leaned close, there was a smell, stale, like something sealed away too long, mixed with the sourness of damp fabric. The knocking grew bolder after that, not louder, but closer. It no longer seemed content to remain inside the walls. One night, the taps landed against the headboard itself, right where my skull touched the pillow. The wood shuddered softly under each knock. I sat up in silence, staring into the dim shape of my room, and I could feel it. Not just sound, but a presence. A rhythm that didn't belong to the house's bones, but to something alive. Sleep became impossible. I lay in the dark, listening, waiting, counting the spaces between knocks. My skin prickled at each one, like icy fingertips brushing the back of my neck. Even when the house was still, I could sense it, like being watched through the thinnest veil. Sometimes I thought I could hear something else too, faint but certain. The sound of breath moving through narrow cracks, just beyond the reach of sight. One evening, when the rest of the house was asleep, I followed the knocks. They came from the wall near the stairwell, tapping in that same deliberate rhythm. I pressed my palm flat against the surface, and to my horror, the wood beneath the wallpaper gave slightly, as if there was not solid structure behind it, only a fragile skin stretched over hollow space. I stayed there, listening, and the knocking answered me from the other side. Not random, not meaningless. It was as though something was acknowledging my touch, waiting for me to respond. My heart hammered so loud I almost believed it could be heard through the wall. I pulled my hand away, but the tapping didn't stop. It followed me as I stepped back down the hall, chasing me in a rhythm that matched my retreat. The days became unbearable, drenched in exhaustion. Every creak of the house made my body tense. I caught myself staring at the walls for too long, tracing the seams of wallpaper, wondering how much space there really was behind them. The thought clawed at me endlessly, that maybe the house wasn't built wrong, maybe it was built around something. Something that was still there. The last night I spent in that room remains carved into me. I woke to the sound of steady knocking, not from a single spot, but from everywhere at once. The walls on both sides, the floor beneath, even the ceiling above, all echoing with dull, deliberate taps. They weren't in unison, but layered, like multiple hands moving through the hollow spaces. I froze, every muscle locked, listening as the rhythm began to overlap into something resembling a pattern, almost like speech. The air thickened. I could smell damp wood and rot, stronger than ever, filling my lungs until I nearly gagged. The knocking drew closer, pressing against the headboard, the closet door, the baseboards. Then it stopped. For a long moment, there was silence so deep I could hear the blood in my ears. And then, from inside the wall, just behind where I lay, something scraped slowly downward, dragging long nails or fingertips across the plaster. The sound lingered, vibrating in my skull, until it felt like it was crawling across my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. My eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room, where the wallpaper had peeled away. For the first time, I saw it, a faint bulge in the surface, pressing outward, like something on the other side was leaning close, straining against the thin barrier between us. I don't remember how long I lay there before I ran. All I know is that when I finally tore myself from the bed and bolted down the hall, the walls echoed behind me with furious, frantic knocks, so many that the entire house seemed to pulse with them. We didn't stay much longer in that place. My parents thought it was stress or nerves, or just the difficulty of moving to a new town. But even now, years later, I can still feel it. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear that same hollow rhythm echoing in the quiet spaces of my mind. And sometimes, in the silence of my room, I swear I can hear it again. 3 slow taps, from inside the wall. I had always imagined cabins to be safe. Something about wood and stone sitting deep in the forest feels honest, comforting even. A place where the outside world and its noise can't touch you. That's what my partner and I thought when we rented one for the weekend. A little getaway in the mountains, far from highways, far from the faint hum of streetlights, and far from the endless chatter of people. The cabin was simple. It smelled of pine, old varnish, and something faintly metallic, like the way nails smell if you've held them too long in your hand. The air inside was cooler than outside, almost damp, and the floorboards carried that hollow groan that only comes from age. Dust collected in corners where the broom never seemed to reach, and the walls had a dark grain that caught the light strangely. I remember brushing my hand along the wall near the bed, feeling the way that would seem to breathe under my fingertips, as though air shifted just beneath its surface. That first night, I fell asleep easily. The forest outside was alive with sounds, but not the kind that made you uneasy. Crickets stitched the silence together, and the occasional breeze would run its fingers through the trees. There was a peace to it, the kind of quiet that only comes when you are removed from everything familiar. But sometime in the night, that peace cracked. It started faint, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had really heard it, or if my brain was clinging to the last fragments of a dream. A sound sharp, deliberate, tapping, not outside, not on the door or the window, inside the wall. I froze, the kind of stillness where your body doesn't even feel like it belongs to you anymore. My ears strained, every tiny shift of air amplified in the dark. And then again, 3 soft taps, too slow to be the scurry of an animal, too clean, too controlled. I lay there, not moving, only listening. My partner stirred beside me, breathing shifting in that uneasy rhythm that told me they had heard it too. Neither of us spoke. Words would have felt ridiculous, fragile, as if breaking the silence would invite whatever was inside closer. Minutes bled into more minutes. The tapping returned, sometimes closer to the headboard, sometimes drifting toward the far corner of the room. Always from inside the walls. Always with that same deliberate rhythm. The air grew heavier. I noticed it most in my chest, how it seemed to take longer to pull a breath, as though the cabin itself was pressing against us. The wood creaked in long groans, bending under weight that wasn't there. And through it all, the tapping continued. When it finally stopped, I don't know how long we had been awake. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Silence crept back into the cabin, but it didn't feel natural anymore. It felt forced, like the woods outside had gone still too, listening along with us. I must have fallen asleep eventually, but it was a shallow kind of rest, full of strange half-dreams where I felt the walls swelling and contracting like lungs. The second night was worse. The tapping returned, but not at the same spot. It came from behind the wardrobe this time, low to the floor, then higher, near the window frame. A slow, patient rhythm. Sometimes it came in sets of 3, sometimes 2, sometimes just a single, long pause before another. The sound was never frantic, never random, always steady, as if whoever or whatever was making it knew we were listening. I pressed my hand to the wall once, just beneath the frame. The wood was cool, cooler than the air in the room, and beneath it I swore I felt something faint, the smallest vibration like a pulse. Not the echo of the tapping, something slower. I pulled my hand away and didn't touch the walls again. That night I noticed something new, the smell. It wasn't the faint metallic tang I'd first noticed. It was heavier now, sour and damp, like wet earth or mold that had been sealed away for too long. It drifted out from the seams of the wallboards, so faint you could almost convince yourself it wasn't there. But once you noticed, you couldn't escape it. The air turned colder too. I remember pulling the blanket higher, feeling the way the fabric stuck to my skin where sweat had already cooled. The tapping continued through it all, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough that it seemed only inches from our heads. And then came the scraping. Not long, not violent, just a brief drag of something hard against the wood. Like nails. Not the clean knock of knuckles or a stick, but the gritty scrape of keratin against grain. It didn't last long, just enough to change the room, to make it feel alive in a way that was wrong. By the third night, sleep wasn't something we expected anymore. We just lay in the dark, waiting for it. And it came. The tapping started earlier this time. As soon as the cabin lights were off and the silence of the forest had settled in, the walls began to stir. This time, it wasn't confined to one side. It came from everywhere. Behind the bed, along the floorboards, above us near the rafters. A slow, deliberate chorus of taps. The sound followed us. When I sat up, the tapping seemed to rise closer to my head. When I shifted to the side of the bed, the noise came from the opposite wall, as though something unseen was adjusting, moving with me inside the wooden veins of the cabin. The smell was stronger now. Damp, metallic, heavy. It coated the back of my throat, making each breath taste sour. The air felt almost liquid, like I was inhaling something thick. And beneath the tapping, something else joined in. Faint at first, nearly hidden beneath the rhythm. A muffled sound, like something trying to breathe through the walls. Shallow, irregular breaths. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The hours dragged. My mind stretched every second into something unbearable. The tapping never stopped. The breathing never stopped. And just as the night began to give way to the faintest light of morning, I heard it. Something I will never forget. Not a tap. Not a scrape. A whisper. It wasn't words I could understand. It was too faint, too muffled, but it was there. Right behind the wall, only inches from where I lay. A dry, rasping murmur that slid through the wood like smoke. My skin went cold, every nerve screaming to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I stayed there, staring into the dim light bleeding through the curtains, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. It followed us every night after that, each time louder, each time closer. The tapping, the scraping, the breathing, the whispering. The cabin walls were not empty. They never had been, and I don't think they ever will be. I had been in the dorms for less than 2 weeks when I first heard it. A noise so faint, so fragile in its insistence, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A small knock, not the kind of sharp rap you'd use on a door, but something gentler. Muffled, as though it had to push through layers of wood, insulation, and paint before it could reach me. It came from the plaster wall beside my bed. The dorm itself was old, so old that the floorboards carried a permanent lean, and the ceilings held long cracks like pale veins. The smell was always faintly sour, like mildew fighting to hide under coats of fresh paint and disinfectant. I remember my first night there. I couldn't stop staring at the water stains in the corners, dark shapes that spread like continents on a map. Even then, I had the feeling the building was holding something back. The knock returned the second night. A little clearer. 3 soft taps that came from inside the wall, right beside where my pillow rested. I sat up slowly, the sheets clinging to me with a damp chill. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that might explain it. Pipes, radiators, some trick of the settling wood. But the sound wasn't mechanical. It carried something organic, irregular, like fingertips brushing against plaster. It didn't stop there. Every night it grew bolder. At first, it was only after midnight, when the halls outside were quiet and the thin walls no longer carried the noise of laughter or televisions. I would lay there in the dark, my breath shallow, straining to hear. Sometimes the knocks came as pairs, sometimes as a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. There was never a pattern long enough to feel accidental, and I could never shake the sense that whatever was making the noise knew I was listening. By the end of the first week, I had stopped sleeping on that side of the bed. I pulled my blanket and pillow to the opposite wall, lying as far as I could from the sound. But the plaster betrayed me. The knocking began to travel. If I ignored it long enough, it shifted, inching across the wall toward where I now lay, as though it followed the weight of my body pressed against the mattress. The air in the room began to change, too. During the day, it smelled normal enough, like stale books and fabric softener. But at night, when the knocking began, there was a dampness in the air. A musty, metallic scent, like rust scraped from old pipes mixed with wet soil. It seeped into my sheets, my hair, the back of my throat. Sometimes, when I placed my palm against the plaster, the surface felt wrong. Too cold, too smooth. There was no vibration, no proof of pipes or vermin. Only the dead stillness of painted stone. Yet the moment I pulled my hand back, the knocking would resume, louder, sharper, as if mocking my curiosity. I started noticing other things. The paint along the baseboards had begun to peel in thin strips, curling like old paper. In the mornings, faint dust collected near the wall, a fine white powder that clung to my shoes. And once, when I returned from class, I found a small crack near the floor that hadn't been there before, a jagged line about the size of a fingernail. At night, the knocking pressed deeper into my mind. I would try to distract myself with music, headphones jammed tight, but even then, I felt it, vibrations running through the mattress frame, faint thuds that seemed to echo inside my own skull. I would wake drenched in sweat, convinced that something was just on the other side of the wall, waiting. The worst was the night it began to imitate me. I had been lying perfectly still, trying to breathe quietly, when the knocking started in slow, deliberate bursts. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Against my will, I lifted my knuckles and gently tapped back, just once. A nervous, half-hearted gesture, as though proving to myself that I wasn't afraid. The answer came immediately. 1 knock, stronger, right against where my head had been when I still slept on that side of the bed. I froze, heart pounding, blanket pressed against my chest. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, clinging to my skin. I didn't dare move again, but the wall didn't need my permission. The knocks began to spread, 1 at the baseboard, 1 at shoulder height, 1 higher still, like hands pressing outward from inside the plaster, searching for the seams. That night, I barely slept. Every time my eyes closed, I saw fingers. Pale, thin, bruised fingers, forcing their way through cracks in the wall, nails scraping until they left powder and dust on the floor. When dawn finally broke, I half expected to see holes torn into the plaster, reaching arms waiting for me. But the wall was smooth, clean, silent. Still, the evidence remained in smaller ways. My sheets began to collect fine streaks of dust, though I never placed them near the wall. My textbooks grew faint stains, watermarked edges that curled despite never leaving the desk. And one morning, I woke with grit in my mouth, the bitter taste of lime and plaster coating my tongue, though I hadn't eaten anything before bed. The knocking did not relent. It grew hungrier, faster. Some nights, it shook so violently that the bed frame rattled against the floorboards, a hollow clang echoing like a distant bell. Other nights, it returned to its patient rhythm, a slow, teasing cadence that lulled me towards sleep before striking with sudden force, like someone slamming both fists from the other side. What unsettled me most was the silence between knocks. That waiting, that stillness that pressed in heavier than the noise itself. In those moments, I could almost hear something else, a whisper maybe. Not words, but a soft rush of breath, like lungs struggling against suffocating plaster. I tried to report it once. I told myself I'd go to the resident advisor, maybe maintenance. But when morning came, the story felt absurd. How could I explain that the wall was knocking at me? That it moved, that it followed me, that it seemed alive? I imagined the laughter, the eye rolls, the dismissals about old pipes or rodents. So I stayed quiet, and the wall stayed loud. It has been weeks now. The knocks come every night. I've stopped fighting them. Sometimes I just lay there and count. Sometimes I even press my hand against the plaster again, feeling the cold sink into my skin, waiting for the answering thud. Because I think, whatever is inside there, it knows my heartbeat now. It knows the pace of my breath. And every night, it grows closer to breaking through. I can feel the plaster thinning. The paint along the corner is beginning to bulge. And sometimes when the knocking stops, I swear I can hear nails gently scratching, not against the wall anymore, but just beneath my bed. I don't think anyone ever tells you how fragile nights become after having a child. The house you thought you knew by heart changes. Every creak in the floorboards, every shifting pipe, every sigh of wind against the windows. It all becomes sharper, heavier, like the whole structure is breathing, just to remind you how vulnerable you are now that you're responsible for something so small, so defenseless. The nursery was my world for months. The pale blue walls, still smelling faintly of dried paint mixed with the sweetness of baby lotion. The mobile above the crib that spun with such quiet persistence, its tiny stars dangling and reflecting whatever sliver of moonlight slipped through the curtains. At first, I thought the exhaustion from sleepless nights was playing tricks on me, but the first knock wasn't subtle. It came just after midnight, when the house had settled into silence. I was rocking my son in my arms, his breath puffing softly against my shoulder. I remember the exact texture of that moment, the weight of his little body, the faint dampness of milk at the corner of his lips, the hum of the baby monitor. Then a sound broke through. From the wall beside the crib, a knock. Not the booming strike of wood against wood. Softer, hollow, 3 taps. A rhythm that didn't belong to plumbing or shifting studs. I froze. My son stirred but didn't wake. I told myself it was nothing. Houses speak in strange ways when the night grows deep. Still, I found myself staring at that pale blue wall for what felt like an eternity. The painted surface looked so ordinary, but behind it, I imagined empty spaces, voids that sound could slip through. The next night, it returned. Louder, more deliberate, a dull rapping, as if someone pressed their knuckles against the plaster and let their presence be known. What unnerved me most wasn't the sound itself, but the location. Always the same spot, just above the crib's headboard. Perfectly placed, as though whatever was making it knew exactly where my baby slept. I began to notice how the air shifted when the knocking came. The nursery, once warm and tinged with the soft powdery scent of diapers and lotion, would grow colder, sharper, like air carried in from a forgotten cellar. The smell would change, too. Faint but noticeable, something sour, like damp wood hidden under wallpaper. I stayed longer in the nursery after that. Even when my son slept, I lingered in the rocking chair with my eyes fixed on the wall. My ears tuned to every scrape, every murmur of the house. And it came again, without fail. Some nights it was 2 knocks. Sometimes 4. Once a long dragging sound as if fingers trailed along the inside of the wall, slow and deliberate, tracing. By the 3rd week, the exhaustion was no longer from the baby, but from waiting. Waiting for the knocks, for the hollow reminder that something shared the space where my son lay. My reflection in the nursery window began to look like someone else's face, sunken, pale, eyes rimmed red from staring into the dark too long. I tried to rationalize. Rodents in the walls, maybe. But rodents don't knock. They scurry, they scratch. This was no scurrying. This was communication. One night, I pressed my ear to the plaster. My heart was racing, my son asleep in the crib beside me. The coolness of the wall bit into my skin, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The knocks came, so close it vibrated through the bone of my skull. A set of 3, evenly spaced. Then silence. My skin prickled with the sensation that something on the other side had stopped moving too, listening back, aware of me in the same way I was aware of it. I pulled away, shaking, and scooped up my child. He whimpered softly but did not wake. I couldn't stay in that room, not with the wall so alive with intent. I slept on the couch that night, rocking him until morning light finally spilled through the windows. Days blurred together. I tried not to let anyone see how drained I was, how hollow I felt. The nursery remained a place of dread. Yet I couldn't avoid it. My child needed to be there, and so did I. The knocking evolved. No longer random, it seemed to answer. When I shifted the crib slightly away from the wall, the knocks grew louder, faster, as if angered by the change. When I stood guard in the rocking chair, it would slow, deliberate, one at a time, as though testing my patience. Sometimes, I would hear it even outside the nursery. Faint taps in the hallway, almost like a lure, trying to pull me away. But the center was always that wall. That one patch of plaster where the air soured and the cold pressed hardest. One dawn, after a night of relentless tapping, I noticed something new. The paint above the crib had cracked. Just a small fissure, spiderwebbing outward as though the wall had been stressed from within. I touched it with trembling fingers. The plaster crumbled too easily, brittle, leaving chalky dust on my skin. And from that crack, I swore I felt the faintest push of air, cold, damp, stale, like breath from a mouth that had been sealed too long. I stopped sleeping altogether. My ears lived in the dark, straining, twitching at every sound. My son slept peacefully, oblivious. Sometimes I envied his innocence, his unawareness of the presence behind that wall. Other times, I feared it was him they wanted all along, and I was just the witness. There are nights burned into memory forever, and one stands above all the rest. The nursery was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that doesn't belong to a sleeping house, but to a place waiting. My son stirred, rolling in his crib, a small sigh leaving his lips. Then the knock. But this time it wasn't hollow. It was deeper, sharper, the sound of something hard striking wood rather than plaster. It rattled the crib against the wall. My son jolted awake, crying, his tiny arms flailing. Before I could move, the dragging returned. Not soft this time. Loud. Heavy. A scrape running the entire length of the wall, just above where his head lay. Like nails. Long, deliberate, savoring every inch. The air was unbreathable. A rot seeped into my lungs, the sourness so strong it clawed at my throat. The curtains shifted though the windows were sealed, as though air pushed from behind the wall was finding its escape. I grabbed my son, pressing him against me, feeling his terrified sobs vibrate through my chest. I stumbled back, my eyes fixed on the wall. The fissure in the paint had widened. Tiny flakes drifted down, dusting the crib's headboard. And then, from within that cracked plaster, came the faintest sound of breath. Not mine, not my son's. Something exhaled. Slow, patient, waiting. I never went back to that room after that night. I moved the crib into my bedroom, closed the nursery door, and left it shut. Even now, weeks later, the knocking sometimes finds its way through the walls into the hall at night, faint but determined. But I will never open that door again, because I know if I do, the crack will have spread, and I know that whatever waits inside the nursery wall is no longer content to stay hidden. It wants out, and it knows exactly where my child sleeps. I never liked the basement in my house. It wasn't because of the size. It was large enough, with a low ceiling that forced you to stoop a little as you walked toward the far wall. But because of the way the air seemed different down there. It was always damp, always carrying a faint smell of mold that clung to the back of your throat, no matter how much you scrubbed or sprayed. The cement floor was cracked in places, thin white lines running through it like veins under pale skin. Dust gathered in corners where the foundation met the walls, and cobwebs hung like forgotten curtains. It felt less like part of my home, and more like an old cavity left untouched beneath it. I went down there only when necessary, storing things, changing a breaker, hunting down the source of a leak. Every time I opened the basement door and felt the draft spill up the stairs, it felt like stepping into another world. A place the house didn't want to acknowledge belonged to it. It started with a sound. The first time I noticed it, I assumed it was nothing more than the pipes expanding as the water heater kicked on. A dull, hollow knock that came from the far wall of the basement. It was faint enough that I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. But the next night, it returned. A steady, rhythmic knock, almost like the sound of knuckles rapping against wood. It would come 3 times, pause, then repeat again minutes later. The thing about sounds in a basement is that they don't behave the way you expect. The walls carry them strangely, bending and throwing them back at you in ways that make them difficult to place. You hear something on your left, but when you move toward it, the sound seems to slip behind you. You crouch closer to the floor and realize it's not above or beside you, it's inside. And that was the problem. When I finally decided to investigate, I turned off everything that could make noise. Heater, washer, even the single bare bulb that hummed faintly above the stairs. I let the basement fall into silence, so deep it pressed against my eardrums. Then it came again. 3 knocks, each one sharp and deliberate, not like settling wood or cooling pipes. It was a sound that carried intention. The wall where it came from wasn't special, just old concrete lined with faded paint, the kind that had bubbled and peeled from years of moisture. I ran my hand along it. The surface was cold, almost damp, and the texture scraped against my palm. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. But the knocks returned, right beneath my touch. It felt as if something on the other side was answering me. I didn't sleep well after that. Nights stretched on with a heaviness that made every creak of the house stand out. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to start again. And it always did. Sometimes faint, sometimes louder, always from the basement. The knocks had become a routine, like some invisible presence keeping its own schedule. Days blurred. I found myself going down there more often, trying to trace it. Sometimes I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to catch something beyond the knocking, movement, a whisper of shifting dirt, even the faintest breath. Other times I tapped back. At first, it was just to see if the sound would stop. But it didn't. It changed. The knocks altered their rhythm, as though adjusting in response to me. When I tapped twice, the wall answered twice. When I waited longer, it waited with me. That was when I realized whatever was behind it wasn't random. Weeks passed. The basement became an obsession. I noticed the smell more strongly now, not just mold, but something older, something like damp soil freshly turned. Sometimes I swore I could taste iron in the air, metallic and heavy. The bulb above the stairs flickered more often, throwing shadows that seemed to sway on their own across the cracked walls. I stopped storing things down there, stopped using it for anything but listening. One night, I stayed later than usual, crouched by the wall, my ear pressed so close that the rough texture left marks on my skin. The knocks came steady, one after another, until something new joined them. A faint scraping, as if nails or claws were dragging along the other side, searching for a weakness in the barrier. The sound moved along the wall, following my position, like something pacing me from the dark. I felt my stomach twist. There was nothing on the other side but earth. Solid ground. The basement was built into the slope of the land. There should have been no space for anything to move in there. But the scraping continued, pausing only to let the knocks resume. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't invite friends over. I didn't want anyone else to hear it. It felt like something private now, something that belonged only to me and the house. And yet, the more I kept it to myself, the worse it became. Sleep-deprived nights bled into anxious days. I started hearing faint echoes of the knocking, even when I wasn't in the basement, while I was cooking or showering, or just sitting in silence upstairs. It was always in threes, always hollow, always just on the edge of hearing, as if the walls of the house itself had begun to carry it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I brought tools, a hammer, a chisel. I told myself it was just to check, to put my mind at rest, to prove to myself there was nothing inside. I marked the section of the basement wall where the knocks had been loudest and pressed the cold steel against it. My hand trembled as I raised the hammer. The sound came before I struck. 3 knocks. Stronger this time. So close it felt like the vibration passed through the tool itself. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then, without thinking, I drove the chisel into the wall. Concrete crumbled easily. Beneath the outer layer, the material was brittle, fractured by years of dampness. I dug deeper, each strike echoing in the basement like a heartbeat. Dust filled the air, gritty against my tongue. My arms ached, but I didn't stop. The knocks had gone silent, but that silence only urged me on. When I broke through, I expected to hit dirt, but what spilled out wasn't soil. It was air. Cold, stale, suffocating air that smelled of rot. Behind the wall was a cavity, a hollow space that should not have existed. My flashlight beam cut into the opening, illuminating rough earthen surfaces. And there, against the far side, something pale shifted just out of the light's reach. The knock came again, not from inside the wall this time, from inside the cavity, loud, insistent, and then something answered it from deeper still. It started so quietly that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. A faint tapping, distant and steady, like something small brushing against the wood of the walls. At first, I thought it was the old pipes, the way the house seemed to breathe with groans and cracks when the air cooled at night. But pipes don't knock in rhythm. Pipes don't wait, listen, then resume as if they're following you. The first night, I was in the living room. The air smelled faintly of old varnish and dust, those scents that cling to an older house, buried in the fibers of the wood and carpet. My lamp cast a weak amber glow, trembling slightly because the bulb was loose in its socket. I remember that detail clearly because as I sat on the couch with my knees pulled up, I heard the first knock. Not a random thud, not the shuffle of the house settling. It came in a series, 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced. A pause, then another 3. My eyes drifted toward the far corner of the room, where the sound seemed to bleed from inside the wall itself. I sat still, waiting, counting. When I stood to move toward the hallway, the knocks stopped. The silence stretched, thick and pressing, the kind of silence where every sound of your own body feels exaggerated. The rustle of fabric, the click of your jaw, even the pulse in your ears. Then, when I stepped into the hall, it started again. 3 knocks. Same pace, same rhythm. This time, it was behind me. That was the moment a shiver worked its way through my skin. Because the sound hadn't stayed in the living room, it had moved with me. I turned every light in the house on after that. Yellow pools of brightness spilled across every surface, making the shadows retreat into the smallest corners. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence, my imagination building patterns from random noises. But deep down, I knew better. The following nights, it continued. Always the same rhythm, always the same steady patience. It didn't matter if I was in the kitchen, the bedroom, or even the bathroom. The knocking would begin a few minutes after I settled in. The sound always came from behind, just slightly out of sight. I began to notice small details. The way the air would feel cooler just before it began, as if the warmth of the room was being drained away. Or the way the smell of the house, normally stale with old carpet and wood, would shift into something sharper, metallic, like the tang of rust. Sometimes, the lamp light would dim as if the power was straining under an invisible weight. The knocks never grew frantic. They never grew louder. They stayed steady, patient, measured, almost expectant. One night, I decided to test it. I walked from room to room slowly, pausing deliberately, listening. The knocks followed, keeping their rhythm, but never breaking stride. If I stopped in the hallway, they would come from the wall nearest me. If I entered the bedroom, they would drift along the plaster there, tapping faintly just out of reach. I realized with horror that it wasn't the walls making the sound. It was something moving inside them, something that moved when I did. I barely slept after that. The house took on a different presence in the daylight, almost mocking me with its normalcy. Sunlight softened the colors of the wallpaper, catching in the dust that drifted lazily through the air. But even then, faintly, if I was quiet enough, I could hear a knock. Just once, then silence, like it wanted me to know it hadn't gone anywhere. At night, the fear was worse. Shadows seemed thicker, stretching along the floor as though they were trying to touch me. The rhythm of the knocks became as familiar as my own heartbeat. 3 pause, 3 pause. It was always behind me, always waiting. One evening, I tried sitting in complete darkness. I turned off every light, sat in the living room, and let the black swallow me whole. The smell of dust and old varnish was stronger in the dark, as though sight had muted and the other senses had grown sharper. The house creaked around me, but I waited, my breath shallow. The first knock came softer than usual. I barely registered it over the sound of my own pulse. But it was there. Then another. Same rhythm, but closer. The darkness made it worse. Without the comfort of light, every knock seemed amplified, pressing against my chest. I swear I could feel the vibration of it in the floorboards beneath my feet. The strangest part is that I wasn't sure anymore if the sound was behind the walls. It seemed to seep into the air itself, hovering just out of reach, circling me like a predator taking its time. By the 3rd week, I had grown sickly from lack of sleep. My skin felt stretched thin, every noise making me flinch. Even during the day, I felt it watching. The air in the house never warmed again, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. I lived in a constant chill. And then came the night it followed me beyond the house. I had gone outside, desperate for escape. The cool night air smelled of damp earth and cut grass, so different from the suffocating weight of the house. For a few minutes, I thought I had outrun it. The silence was real, deep, and vast beneath the stars. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Not from a wall. From the wooden porch railing, just behind me. My chest froze. The rhythm was the same. Steady, patient, relentless. I ran down the street, barefoot on the cracked pavement, every sound of my own footsteps ricocheting in my ears. But in the spaces between, I heard it. Not loud. Not close. But there. Following. Since then, it has never left. Wherever I go, whatever building I enter, the sound returns within minutes. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Sometimes from the wall, sometimes the floor, sometimes the ceiling above my head. It waits until I am still, until I think I've escaped, and then it begins again. I don't know what it wants. It doesn't speak. It doesn't grow angry. It just follows. Patient, relentless, rhythmic. I have stopped trying to sleep in silence. I keep music playing at all hours, hoping to drown it out. But even beneath the sound, I feel it. Waiting. And sometimes, this is the part that unsettles me the most. When I wake in the half-light of dawn, the knocking has already begun. Not from the walls, not from the floor, but from directly behind the headboard of my bed. I used to tell myself the knocking was nothing more than pipes. Old houses groan and shift, the metal expands, water rushes through unseen channels. It's all noise with an explanation. At least that's what I kept repeating whenever the walls shuddered with that dull, deliberate sound. It started in winter, when the air outside was brittle, and the kind of dry that makes the skin on your hands split open. Our house had always been quiet, the kind of stillness that came with living far away from neighbors. The silence used to be comforting. Then the knocking began. It wasn't random, not the kind of scatter you'd expect from metal or wood shifting. It came in slow, steady bursts. 3 knocks at a time. The sound didn't echo the way pipe noise usually does. It was heavy, like someone pressing a fist to the wall and striking with intent. At first, I brushed it off. Old house, old noises. But the sound didn't fade with time. It followed us. At night, when we tried to sleep, it would begin in the hallway just outside the bedrooms. A hollow thud that shook through the plaster. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to drag me awake, lying stiff under the blankets, counting the intervals between each hit. There was always that pause, long enough to make me think it had stopped. Then another sharp trio of knocks would land. I told myself it was the plumbing, though I couldn't explain why pipes would only knock after midnight. I told myself it was wood contracting, though I couldn't explain why the sound moved from room to room. Because that's what it started to do. One evening, while I was sitting in the living room, the knocks started at the far end of the house. I heard them in the walls of the laundry room first, then the kitchen, then the hall, as though something was making its way closer. Each set of knocks was distinct, traveling along the walls with a rhythm too controlled to be coincidence. By the time it reached the living room, I had stopped pretending it was pipes. The air in the house had changed too. There was always a faint chill, but not the kind you could blame on winter drafts. It was deeper than that, a cold that clung to the skin even when the furnace was roaring. Along with the chill came a smell, faint at first like damp earth. Sometimes stronger, like something rotting quietly behind the walls where I couldn't reach. During the day, the house looked the same, sunlight slanting through the curtains, dust drifting lazily in the air. But I noticed shadows lingered a little too long in the corners. At night, every sound carried differently. The creak of the floorboards under my feet stretched too far. The whisper of wind against the siding seemed to press in harder. And always, beneath it all, was the waiting silence before the next round of knocks. I tried to test it. I banged on the wall back once, knuckles against plaster. For a while, there was nothing. The silence stretched long enough that I felt foolish, standing in the hallway staring at empty paint and wood. Then the answer came, 3 sharp knocks, perfectly mimicking my rhythm, only closer. After that, I stopped challenging it. Nights blurred together. I'd lie awake listening, my heart keeping pace with the sound as it moved through the house. Sometimes it stopped just outside the bedroom door. I would press my ear to the pillow and hold my breath, and that's when I'd hear it, scraping, faint and dragging, like nails or fingertips trailing down inside the wall. The smell grew worse over the weeks. My family noticed it too, though none of us wanted to speak about it. It was strongest in the basement, that deep, earthen odor like wet soil mixed with rust. I avoided going down there, but eventually I had to. The basement was unfinished, just poured concrete and wooden beams. The light down there was weak, a single bulb swaying whenever the furnace kicked on. That night, I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. The house above was still, but down there in the cold, I heard the sound again. 3 dull knocks, this time coming from the far corner where the wall met the floor. The concrete there looked different, stained darker than the rest. I crouched close, touching the surface. It felt damp, as if moisture seeped up from beneath. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard something faint, not water, not pipes, but a slow shuffling sound. Like movement, like something beneath me was dragging itself closer to the thin barrier of concrete. I stumbled back up the stairs and slammed the basement door. I didn't tell anyone what I heard, though I know they sensed it. We all grew quieter in that house, avoiding the subject, avoiding certain rooms. But silence doesn't change what's real. One night, I woke to the sound again, this time louder than ever. The knocks weren't in the walls anymore. They were in the ceiling, above my bed. I lay frozen, staring at the plaster overhead as it trembled with each heavy thud. Dust drifted down, catching the faint glow of the nightlight. Then, for the first time, the knocks didn't come in threes. They came as a rapid flurry, pounding like fists against the ceiling, shaking the entire room. I wanted to scream, but the sound cut off all at once. What followed was worse, silence so heavy it pressed down on me. Then a long, slow scrape, not from above, but from inside the wall directly beside my bed. Something was moving there, inches away, dragging across the beams. I pressed my hand to the plaster and felt the vibration of it. We left the house not long after. My family told people it was because of the age of the place, the repairs it needed, the smell we could never seem to get rid of. But I knew. Pipes don't knock with intention. Wood doesn't scrape like fingernails. And silence doesn't wait for you the way that house did. Even now, in a different home, sometimes I wake in the night. The air will be still, the room perfectly quiet, but I'll lie there listening, waiting. And sometimes, just beyond the edge of sleep, I swear I hear it again, 3 deliberate knocks, far away but moving closer.